Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
"You're forbidden to wear white, you're not pure," my sister said in the kind of sugar-frosted voice people use when they want to slap to sound like a compliment, and although a dozen relatives pretended to study the floral centerpieces as if hydrangeas could save them, everyone watched me the way people watch a backyard firework that might tip over and scorch the lawn, which is to say with pity, curiosity, and a little hope for drama, while I stood there and smiled like a woman who had learned the hard way that silence can be heavier than a sermon and sharper than a knife. I could taste old dust in that ballroom air, the kind that settles on family stories and makes them look antique and valuable, and I thought about how my mother had always admired a spotless tablecloth more than a clean conscience, how my aunts could iron out a wrinkle faster than they could smooth a rumor, how the men shook hands with my commander at the memorial yet never once told me they were proud, and somehow all of that packed itself into the pause between my sister's words and my answer, because I did not argue or plead or make a speech about honor or service or any of the things people drag out when they want to sound righteous. I just nodded as if she had reminded me to turn off the porch light, and I said, "Got it," in a tone that even I barely recognized as mine. If you have ever been scolded like a child after surviving something that would rattle grown men, you understand the trick my breath played on me. How it stayed shallow and stubborn in my chest even while my mind wandered to places with dust and heat and the dull clink of metal, places where white meant a sheet over a stretcher and not a dress code. And I realized again how strange it is that people who never saw my work can still judge my worth, as if mileage on a woman's soul could be measured by the shade on her shoulders, as if gossip were a Geiger counter that clicks louder around women who do not apologize for breathing. My sister, Danielle, beamed at the wedding planner in a way that said a problem had been solved, like I was a smudge on the mirror finally wiped away. The planner jotted something in a leather notebook that did not have a section for shame. And my mother lifted her chin and said she was relieved because we can keep the theme, and I, the black coffee at a tea party, decided I would not give them the joy of a scene or the gift of my pain poured onto their shoes. I glanced down at the soft dove-gray dress I had picked because it was respectful and simple and did not try to compete with a bride who loved to compete, and I thought about how, when we were girls, white was the color of those cheap lace gloves our grandmother made us wear to church, the ones that itched like penance and smelled like a drawer where mothballs went to die. Danielle always ripped hers off in the car and swore she had never had them on. And I sat with mine folded in my lap like I was guarding a secret, and maybe that was the difference between us that no one wanted to admit, that I learned to carry things, and she learned to drop them before they got heavy. Around us, the venue staff moved with the clean choreography of people who measure time in courses and toasts, and an aunt I had not seen in years slid close enough to whisper that she understood the rule and hoped I would not be offended, then pulled away before I could tell her that offense requires surprise, and I had long run out of that commodity. The groom's father, a quiet man with the posture of an old oak, caught my eye from across the room and did a small, almost invisible nod. Not approval, not pity, just a human acknowledgement like two headlights flicking once on a dark road. And the steadiness of it cooled my neck where a flush had climbed, and I took that as my cue to breathe better and move with intention. I said something polite to the planner about needing a moment to check on the florist, and I stepped out of the rehearsal bustle, past a table where place cards waited like tiny verdicts, past the sign that said, "Welcome to our forever," the sort of sentiment that looks good on wood and falls apart in real wind, and I walked down the service corridor that smelled like lemon cleaner and steam and baked sugar until I reached the quiet hum of the kitchen, where the pastry chef was piping buttercream onto practice rounds like snowfall that knew what it was doing. On the metal prep shelf, off to the side where a line cook had parked it like a toy that didn't belong in a grown-up room, sat the cake topper my sister had chosen, a porcelain bride and groom with eyes as wide as coins and a dress wider than rulebooks. The kind of figurine that expects the world to hold still while it photographs well, and for a heartbeat I imagined those tiny faces whispering that I should know my place, which is ridiculous because figurines do not speak, but you would be surprised at what objects say when families use them as weapons. The pastry chef noticed me and asked if I needed anything, and I told him I was only here to admire the architecture, that I had a weakness for structures and sugar because they always look like they will last and almost never do. And he laughed in that way kitchen people laugh when they are 3 crises into a day and still standing, then turned back to his buttercream snowfall, leaving me alone with the figurine that looked like a sermon you could dust. No one had to teach me how to improvise. The world did that when it handed me problems with clocks attached, so I slipped my phone from my clutch, opened a little photo folder titled Spare Parts, and checked what I had tucked away on purpose for a project I had abandoned. A tiny plastic figure of a saluting soldier from a charity centerpiece, dull olive, simple, a toy really, but sturdy in its stance, and an old brass charm shaped like a dove that once hung from a friend's bracelet. I had meant to make a shadow box for a fundraising auction, never found the hour, carried the pieces with me anyway like pocket lint with history. My hands moved while my mind asked if this was petty, if this was childish, if I cared even a little bit whether the word petty could cover the bruise I had been given in public, and I decided that sometimes a bruise deserves a fingerprint back, not to harm, but to mark, to say I was here and I noticed, to say I do not need to shout to return the favor. In less than the time it takes to frost a tear, I wrapped the porcelain pair in a clean towel and tucked them behind the stack of cake rounds like they were napping. Then I set the small plastic soldier on the topper base, anchored him with a dot of royal icing the chef would not miss, hung the brass dove from his little arm where it curved upward in salute, and stepped back to look at my tiny, ridiculous monument to gallows humor and proportion, a wink disguised as respect. A reminder that purity means different things depending on whether you have ever washed your hands in a metal basin under a sky full of grit. My chest loosened a notch. I left the kitchen the way I came, slow, polite, invisible where it counts, and I rejoined the hum of the rehearsal as if I had only taken a breath. When Danielle waved me over to approve the seating chart like a queen pretending to consult a parliament, I smiled with all my teeth and told her it looked perfect, that it was her day, and I would not dream of coloring outside her lines. And then I excused myself again, this time to the parking lot where the evening light turned the asphalt to warm slate and the cicadas worked like 1,000 tiny engines, and I slid into my car and shut the door on the whole performance. I did not cry, not because I am made of stone, but because I have learned that tears are a currency, and I do not spend them where the exchange rate is bad. I sat, breathed, and let the quiet do its work. My little act of mischief will not fix anything big, I told myself as the steering wheel cooled my palms, yet there is a pleasure in setting a story straight by a hair, in putting one honest soldier on a mountain of sugar, in knowing that when they lift the cover for the grand reveal, the room will have to swallow a different definition of white. Consider it my first course of revenge, small, neat, and plated with a smile, and now that I had tasted it, I knew I would need something stronger before the night was done. The thing about humiliation, especially the kind delivered with a satin ribbon and a perfect manicure, is that it doesn't come alone. It arrives with its cousins, memory, comparison, and the slow drumbeat of every time you swallowed something bitter because you were told it would be good for the family. And as the rehearsal dinner took over the ballroom with its navy napkins and centerpieces that tried very hard to smell like spring, I could feel that drumbeat under the tablecloth while Danielle rehearsed her smile, and our mother floated from conversation to conversation like a parade balloon tethered by etiquette, insisting the evening remain classy, as if class were a varnish layered thick enough to hide the grain. People who had known us since we fought over hairbrushes came up to me and performed a ritual I recognized from airports and church basements, a kind of conversational pat-down where they searched for signs of volatility or regret, asking about my base and my plans and whether I had finally settled down, which is what folks say when they cannot imagine that a woman might burn bright without building a little domestic altar to prove she is safe, and I answered in sentences that felt both true and useless, watching the chandelier light skitter across wine glasses, while a slideshow of the happy couple looped above the portable bar, full of beach sunsets and coordinated shirts and the sort of smiles that are convinced they will never be tested. It was somewhere between the second toast and the entree that I heard it, not because I was trying to listen, but because the room itself tilted the sound toward me the way a stadium carries a chant. A small knot of bridesmaids near the back where the air conditioners exhaled, Danielle at the center with her champagne flute poised like a wand, telling them in a voice that performed intimacy while aiming for distance that I only enlisted because my college fiancé had failed and I needed attention, that I loved being saluted more than I loved people, that I hid behind medals because I couldn't keep a man, and though the words were childish, they wore adult shoes, heavy with repetition and the permission of an audience, which is always more dangerous than a sharp tongue alone. I did not interrupt, partly because experience had taught me that cutting off an amateur surgeon only makes the scar worse, partly because there is a particular strength in letting a person finish carving their own confession out loud, and partly because I had another plan tugging at my sleeve, one that asked for composure now and payment later, and I have always been better at delayed gratification than Danielle ever cared to be. When the MC, a rented charisma with a clipboard, started a game where guests had to guess who said what from the couple's past texts, I excused myself with a smile that had passed every inspection, drifted toward the side hall where the display easels waited for tomorrow's photo corner, and opened the flat archival box I had tucked beneath the lowest shelf when I arrived, the one I carried through 3 airports and a layover because my gut told me it might be needed. Inside lay a slim album and a stack of mounted clippings that never made it into family lore, not because they were shameful, but because they weren't glittering. The community cleanups after hurricanes where we hauled wet carpets from living rooms on streets with names that never make the news. The day my unit read with 4th graders after their school reopened. The notice about Sergeant Alvarez's scholarship fund with a small black and white photo of his mother. The citation for a life-saving I didn't want. Applauded, but could not deny happened, and I laid them out in a quiet row so that tomorrow, when guests queued for cake and perfect first dance photos, they would stand with their plates of sugar and see a different definition of service staring back. Not in my voice or my face, but in ink and the calm weight of paper. As I worked, careful with the corners the way you are with a friend's baby, the groom's father appeared in the doorway like an old movie stepping into focus, his tie loosened. His eyes carrying that peculiar softness men sometimes acquire when time has sanded down their certainty, and he asked if he could help without making a performance of it, which is the only way I accept help. I told him he could hand me the clips, and we stood together in companionable silence, punctuated by the little clicks of metal, and after a while he said that when he came back from his war people threw a parade and then forgot to ask how he slept, and I said that my generation does not get parades, but we still prefer honest questions. And he nodded like a man turning the ignition of an old truck just to hear it catch. He did not praise me, which I appreciated, and he did not apologize for his son marrying my sister, which would have been absurd. He simply said, "You don't need white to look like the real thing," and it landed less like a compliment and more like a hand steadying a ladder, just enough pressure to keep it from wobbling. By the time we returned to the ballroom, the MC had finished his game and Danielle was instructing the photographer to crop me out of a test shot so the color tones stay consistent, which earned her a ripple of agreement from girls who love rules when rules protect their thrones, and I felt a familiar heat crawling up my throat that said I might say something I would enjoy now and regret later. So instead, I lifted my glass and asked for a minute during the toasts, not to tell a story or make a point, but to give a gift. I pulled from my bag a small lacquered box that belonged to our grandmother, the one with the velvet that still carried the faintest trace of cologne and talc, opened it in front of the room, and presented Danielle with the pair of lace gloves we used to wear on Easter Sundays, saying that since she loved tradition, I hoped she would wear them tomorrow because they would match her theme and, more importantly, remind her that our grandmother used to say purity had less to do with fabric and more to do with keeping your hands useful. Laughter moved through the room in an uncertain wave, not uproarious, not cruel, the kind of laughter people make when they know a dart has flown and are waiting to see where it lands. Danielle blushed the color of a rumor and slipped the box shut with a snap that was not a thank you, and our mother clapped twice as if to close the curtain on my scene, declaring it sweet and appropriate, which are words you sprinkle when you hope to smother I did not linger on the victory, because small victories are like mints after a difficult meal, pleasant but insufficient, and as the band tested their chords and the venue manager dimmed the sconces, I slipped away again. This time to the parking lot where the dark had settled thick and honest, and I unlocked the trunk of my car where a deployment footlocker lay under a blanket like a sleeping animal. When I lifted the lid, the clean smell of wool and oil rose up. The uniform folded too. Regulation, and the medals wrapped in tissue that whispered like dry leaves, and as I traced the cool edge of one ribbon with my thumb, my phone lit with my mother's name followed by a string of warnings about tomorrow and requests for good behavior, which I let pass across the screen without answer, because there is a point at which explanations become a kind of begging, and I refuse to beg to be seen. I closed the locker, pressed my palms flat against the lid as though signing a quiet contract with myself. And in the reflection of the back window I saw a woman I recognized again. Not the neat guest in dove gray, not the tolerated sister with her edges sanded down for the sake of photos, but the person who knows how to move a plan from intention to execution. And I smiled without joy, because joy would be premature, and because somewhere inside the building a porcelain bride and groom were sleeping off their demotion while a small plastic soldier guarded the cake, and because tomorrow I would walk through a different door and let the room decide what purity looked like when it stood on its own 2 feet and did not ask permission. Morning came dressed like a polite stranger who knows your address, but not your history, pale light sliding across the hotel carpet while the phone on my nightstand chimed with reminders I had not set, florist confirmations, hair and makeup timelines. A mother's barrage of instructions punctuated by warnings about punctuality and peacekeeping, every message a small brick in the wall they hoped would corral me into a role I had never auditioned for, and I lay there long enough to watch the ceiling fan turn circles that pretended to be progress before I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and decided that today would not belong to choreography or to the version of me Danielle preferred, the soft-focused sister edited to match a theme. Because the only theme I would honor was the one stitched into the inner pocket of a jacket that had felt heavier than pride and lighter than apology on nights when I stood guard under a sky that forgot to blink. I showered without hurry, the hot water pushing the last residue of yesterday's sugar off my skin, slipped into jeans and a plain shirt, and packed the dove gray dress back into its garment bag like a relic of a plan I had retired. Then lifted the footlocker onto the bed and opened it the way you open something sacred in a borrowed chapel, careful hands, steady breath, no words. Only the quiet conversation of wool and ribbon and insignia that carry more stories than most speeches could manage, and as I traced the seam of the jacket I thought about the countless hours in which clothing had been armor, not costume, and how fitting it felt that my answer to a superficial rule about white would be a lesson in the deep work of another kind of uniform. Down in the lobby, the wedding shuttle idled like a bribe, door yawning open, driver cheerful, bridesmaids ascending in a bloom of perfume and hairspray that could have fueled an orchestra. And when they saw me with no garment bag and no lacquered curls, they performed that little collective tilt of the head women do when they have rehearsed concern but are measuring compliance, chirping about the schedule and the sunlight and the need for cohesion, while my phone added its own chorus with Danielle's name and a message that combined command and threat in a single line, "Please do not make today about you," which would have amused me if it hadn't been a familiar script. So instead of boarding, I smiled in a way that said I had errands and goodwill and would be along shortly, then turned my back on the shuttle door with the same calm I had used to turn away from more dangerous invitations, and walked into the already warming morning. Keys in hand, plan quickening its pulse like a runner who knows the course because she mapped it herself in the dark. Some acts of revenge are loud and look like fireworks. Mine today would move like a weather front changing pressure, invisible until the door opens and the air itself feels different. So the first stop was a craft store that smelled like cinnamon and cardboard, where I bought spools of white ribbon and a small stamp kit with an ink pad the color of new bone, and on the drive to the venue I thought about hands, the ones that do work and the ones that pose, and I decided that if Danielle insisted on owning the color with her theology of appearances, I would offer it back to the room with a better story. not shouted from a microphone, but tied quietly to wrists that had actually done something worth blessing. At the loading dock, I found the venue coordinator already juggling crisis, a late florist, a missing boutonniere, a cake pedestal that did not fit its assigned platform, and I asked her, in the voice you use when you know tension and timetables, and how to make both obey, whether I might donate a small gesture for the guest tables, white ribbons stamped with a simple phrase, for hands that serve, to be placed beside each napkin along with a card inviting guests, if they wished, to tie one on in honor of anyone who had ever brought them through a hard year, service members, nurses, teachers, foster parents, recovery sponsors, neighbors who show up with casseroles when the quiet is too loud, and though she hesitated, mindful of brides and their lists, the groom's father appeared again like Providence with a toolbox and a calm yes, telling the coordinator that any family that feared a ribbon probably feared mirrors. And with his backing, she sent a staffer for table maps while I cut lengths of ribbon and stamped the tiny phrase until my fingertips took on the faint ghost of the words. By the time the quartet began to tune in the garden and the photographer started arranging shoes and bouquets like a still life that didn't know it would age, the banquet hall had been seated with something Danielle could not control, a conversation waiting at every plate. And I took a slow lap among the round tables to make sure nothing shouted, because subtlety is an art and clutter ruins the eye, and then I slipped through the corridor to the photo corner to check the quiet exhibit I had built the night before. The mounted clippings and snapshots waited like witnesses who do not raise their voices unless truth requires it, and I straightened the smallest frame, the one about Sergeant Alvarez's scholarship fund, and felt that odd ache the body carries for men whose mothers will forever sit in front rows they never wanted, and I promised, not to God and not to Danielle, but to myself and the steadier parts of the room, that my entrance would never turn grief into theater. It would only ask for a silence that looked like respect. My phone vibrated so insistently I finally turned it face up to watch the parade of messages scroll. My mother instructing, Danielle warning, a cousin gossiping about a last-minute seamstress emergency, and then, a surprise. A text from the groom's father that was as uncluttered as a good oath. When you arrive, walk through the west doors, not the main, less of a circus, better light. I'll be there. I drove back to the hotel with the steadiness people mistake for detachment, carried the footlocker down to the car like a woman relocating a safe, and dressed in the quiet shade of the back lot where the smell of cut grass mixed with the faint sweetness of spilled champagne from last night's deliveries, sliding into the uniform piece by piece the way you climb back into yourself after too many days of playing agreeable, smoothing the jacket, lifting my hair, adjusting the small bar of ribbons, so they lay straight as a measured breath, and when I laced the boots I felt the old focus gather, not the defensive vigilance of patrol, but the forward pull of a mission that will not raise a weapon unless forced. A mission that believes presence can rearrange a room better than any speech. In the rearview mirror, the woman who looked back at me was not interested in apology or invitation. She was interested in accuracy, in duration, in the math of what you carry and what you refuse to carry anymore, and as I fastened the last clasp I thought again about Danielle's decree and the ridiculousness of purity measured by fabric, and I found, to my own slight shock, that I could forgive her someday, not now, not before the walk, but someday when we could laugh about cake toppers and gloves and the ways girls are trained to believe dresses are theology, not costumes. At the curb by the west entrance the groom's father waited as promised, no fanfare, only the quiet readiness of a man who understands that timing is a form of mercy. And he opened the door without commentary and said the simplest sentence a person can offer another when spectacle threatens to swallow the good part, whenever you're ready. And as the quartet shifted from warm-up into the soft prelude that signals the seating of grandparents and the turning of heads, I stepped into the threshold, where cool indoor air met bright garden heat, and for a long breath the world held still like a stage before the curtain lifts, while somewhere beyond the double doors my sister raised her champagne and announced that the show was about to begin, not knowing that mine had been in rehearsal for years and that the room was already changing its shape to fit it. The air inside the reception hall had that thick, expensive quiet that lives between string music and gossip. The kind of quiet that costs thousands in floral arrangements and coordination fees yet breaks like thin glass the moment someone steps in wearing something unscripted. When the west doors opened and I crossed the threshold, I felt that quiet tighten, stretch, and then collapse inward as though the room itself had forgotten to breathe. Light from the chandeliers caught the polished brass of my medals, scattering fragments of reflection across the nearest wall. And for a fraction of a second it seemed as though the entire crowd was waiting for an announcement to explain why the bride's sister had arrived dressed for a ceremony that belonged to another kind of battlefield. I had expected whispers, maybe a chuckle from one of Danielle's bridesmaids who collected secrets the way some people collect coupons, but what came instead was a silence that held its own posture rigid, deliberate, filled with the uneasy awe that only truth, when embodied without apology, can produce. I walked slowly, not to dramatize the moment, but because years of protocol had taught me that pacing is power, that stillness and movement can tell a story long before words arrive, and as I passed each table I saw heads tilt, mouths part, and eyes follow like I was both an intrusion and a reminder that not every kind of purity fits in a white frame. Danielle stood near the stage, bouquet in hand, the train of her gown draped like a sigh that had nowhere to fall, and when our eyes met her expression flickered, surprise first, then irritation. Then the kind of dawning recognition that comes when someone realizes their control has an expiration date. My mother, seated at the family table beside the groom's parents, looked suddenly smaller, her fingers pressed to her pearls as though touching tradition might keep it from cracking. The photographer, bless his confusion, lifted the camera, then lowered it again, unsure whether to document what might later be labeled a scandal or a symbol. I stopped a few steps from the couple, nodded to the officiant, and said, quietly but clearly enough for the microphone to catch, that I had come to deliver my own kind of blessing, one earned, not bestowed, and that I would keep it short because service, in every form, teaches you to respect time. The toast I offered was not rehearsed in words, but in feeling, a memory stitched from a dozen moments when silence had saved me more than speech ever could. I lifted my glass and said that there are two kinds of purity in the world, the one people wear and the one they live through, the kind that can be stained and still be clean because it has survived something worth surviving. I said that love, if it's real, does not fear what has been weathered, and that the truest vows are not spoken under chandeliers, but whispered in the dark between people who choose to stay. The guests, unprepared for sincerity at a function built on performance, remained frozen until the groom's father, a man whose years had taught him the difference between ceremony and substance, stood up, raised his own glass, and said, "To those who fight the battles we never see." The first clap came from him, the second from someone near the bar, and then, like a tide giving up resistance, the applause spread, uneven, but growing until even the band joined with a few hesitant chords that turned the moment into something larger than etiquette could contain. Danielle's smile returned, but it was the kind that had to be held in place, too tight at the corners, eyes doing the math of reputation and optics. She thanked me in a voice polished by microphones, said how proud she was of me, how strong, how inspiring, each word sliding through clenched teeth while her fingers strangled the bouquet stems. I could almost feel the panic behind her compliments, the calculation of how to reclaim a spotlight that no longer obeyed her choreography, and I let her have the illusion, because mercy, when chosen deliberately, can be the most disarming form of power. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me over the applause and said, "Don't worry, sis, I'm not here to take your day. I just came to remind you what survival looks like when it stands up straight." Then I stepped back, saluted the groom's father with a small nod, and turned toward the crowd, whose clapping had softened into something almost reverent. As I made my way toward the exit, snippets of murmurs trailed behind, admiration from some, envy from others, disbelief from those who prefer their courage prepackaged in acceptable stories. A few guests reached out to touch my sleeve, small gestures of solidarity that required no language, and one older woman, a neighbor from our childhood street who used to hand out popsicles in summer, whispered, "You did right by yourself, honey." before returning to her seat with a dignity that reminded me where I had first learned the value of quiet rebellion. At the door, I paused to look back one last time. Danielle was surrounded by guests, smiling for a new photo, her expression composed, but her posture betraying the tension of someone holding a pose for too long. My mother sat still, hands folded now, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decode, not approval, not disapproval, something heavier, maybe regret, maybe the dawning understanding that purity had been misdefined all along. Outside, the evening air felt thick and cool, the kind of air that carries the scent of grass and diesel and endings. I stood under the overhang, listening as the muffled hum of music resumed inside, the world of crystal and champagne moving on as though the interruption had been a brief weather event rather than a shift in atmosphere. The groom's father joined me, carrying 2 glasses of bourbon instead of champagne, and handed me one without a word. We stood like sentinels, watching the reflections of the chandeliers ripple across the parking lot puddles, and after a while he said, "You didn't humiliate her, you just rearranged the light." I nodded, because that was close enough to the truth, and because explanations would only dilute what had already spoken for itself. When I finally walked away, the gravel crunching under my boots felt like punctuation, not the end of a sentence, but the turning of a page, and as the last echo of applause dissolved into the distance, I realized that revenge, when done right, doesn't leave scorch marks. It leaves understanding, slow and permanent, like ink settling into paper. The night did not end so much as change temperature, shifting from the brittle applause of a room trying to normalize itself back into choreographed celebration to the heavier quiet of a parking lot where people come when the performance starts to itch. And I stood with the bourbon warming my hand while the reflections of chandeliers trembled in shallow puddles like nervous promises, thinking about how revenge, when it works, does not raise its voice, it just changes the room's oxygen, and that thought was still settling when my mother pushed through the west doors with the careful gait of someone determined to look composed while crossing unfamiliar terrain, her shawl clutched like a truce flag and her expression arranged into something softer than I had expected, though not entirely free of calculation, and she said my name in the tone she reserves for holidays and trouble, which, in our family, are often the same thing. She began with practicalities, because mothers of her era use logistics as a shield for feelings, telling me the timeline had shifted and the cake would be cut earlier and the photographer wanted a sister shot if I would please cooperate, and only then. When the breeze lifted the edge of her shawl and the perfume of fresh cut grass overpowered the last of the ballroom's sugar, did she say that the word pure had not been meant to wound, that Danielle was sensitive about optics and that my uniform, though beautiful, was unexpected, and I could taste the old trick where apology wears lace so it can pass inspection, yet something faltered in her delivery, a tiny break that let through a sentence she had not planned to say, that she had repeated the rumor years ago because she thought it would keep me from making rash choices, and that every time she told it she hated herself a little more, and while I did not give her absolution, I did not hand her humiliation either, because there is a kind of satisfaction that tastes like ashes the next morning, and I have learned to keep my mouth clean of it. Before I could answer, the west doors opened again and Danielle came out with the speed of someone who can feel her narrative tilting and wants to yank it back by the hair, bouquet abandoned, veil pinned in place by too many bobby pins to tear free without pain. Her eyes glittering not with tears, but with the calculation of a woman who has always known how to organize a room and cannot understand why the room refuses to be organized, and she told me in a low voice that what I had done was selfish and theatrical and that I had stolen her moment, then immediately shifted registers to praise and charm because the groom's father had appeared behind her like a witness you cannot dismiss, calling me brave and radiant and a credit to the family. After which she switched again and offered a truce in the language of public relations, suggesting we take a photo that would go viral for the right reasons, a sentence so smooth it nearly slid out of my hands before I caught what it meant. I told her, quietly, that I would stand for a photograph as long as she wore our grandmother's lace gloves, not to punish, but to remember, and that we would include the little white ribbon stamped for hands that serve to make the image honest. And for a heartbeat, she looked at me with a flash of the girl who used to hide under the table during thunder, and I saw something like fear of being small pass through her. But pride reasserted itself, and she said yes, of course. She could do symbolism if it meant regaining control, which told me what I needed to know about the limits of her growth. Inside, the band played that cheerful march people use to herd strangers toward cake. The MC raised his microphone with a salesman's grin, and the pastry cart rolled in like a polished idea, the tiers perfect. The buttercream more expensive than most childhood lessons, and when the silver dome lifted and the room saw, not the porcelain bride and groom, but a small saluting soldier steadying a brass dove as if reconciliation could be balanced in one hand. A wave moved through the guests that began as laughter and ended as something else, a hush that was not silence but attention, and the photographer, finally decisive, started snapping frames that would outlive the arguments we were still having. While Danielle leaned toward me and whispered that she would allow the joke if I promised not to escalate, a word that belongs to operations orders more than weddings. And I told her that escalation is what happens when people respond to mercy with manipulation, and that my plans for the evening did not include humiliation, only clarity, which she heard as threat because she has never trusted a sentence without sharp edges. I did not seize the microphone or deliver a speech designed to crack the glass. Instead, I handed the MC an envelope he had been instructed to open after the cake, which he did with professional confusion, announcing to the room that the couple, in lieu of favors, had made a donation in every guest's name to the scholarship fund carrying Sergeant Alvarez's name, a fund that would put books and rent into the hands of a kid who might otherwise choose a uniform for reasons other than vocation. And for a breath the crowd misheard it as a boast until the groom's father stepped forward and said he had matched the gift privately. At which point something like a ripple of decency moved from table to table and people began tying their little white ribbons on their wrists with a care that told me the message had landed, though not, perhaps, where Danielle wanted credit to land. And she understood in a way visible only in the tightening of her jaw that this was a revenge she could not undo. Because it came dressed as kindness and attached itself to a ledger larger than her guest list. The photographer called for a sister shot, and we stood together with our grandmother's gloves between us like an inheritance we were finally willing to hold without pretending it was comfortable. And when the flash popped, I felt a fatigue arrive that had less to do with conflict and more to do with the effort it takes to keep choosing a version of yourself that does not burn down the whole room just because you can. So I kissed my mother's cheek, told the groom to take care of the woman he had married even when she thought control could substitute for love, and walked toward the west doors with my head clear and my boots the only punctuation I needed. In the darkness, my phone vibrated again, a string of texts stacked like a nervous deck, the last one from Danielle. One sentence that tried to bridge a canyon with ribbon, "I'm sorry, but you know how I am." And I stood beneath the quiet sky and wondered whether people are ever only how they are or whether they are also the sum of what we accept and resist and forgive, then put the phone away without answering, not as punishment, not as victory, simply as a promise to myself that the next chapter would not be written on the same paper. And when I pulled onto the road, the metals on my chest caught the last slice of ballroom light, throwing it back into the dark like a breadcrumb trail nobody else needed to follow, and I drove without turning on the radio, letting the silence tell me what the applause could not, that purity is not a color and closure is not a ceremony, and that some truths do not resolve, they settle, and they make room.